Hi. So in my past two responses, I focused on the Al-Malaika poem, The Arrival of Sadness. In my first response, I wanted to embody the type of criticism of the classical Arabic scholars, and in my reading of their work, I found their minute focus on syntax and the operation of metaphor to be central. And so in my analysis, I did the same, picking apart the metaphors, trying to find what about this collection of words made it feel meaningful to me. My core insight was an apparent inversion of metaphor in the poem. Recall the structure of the metaphor of the classical Arabic scholars. We have the topic, which is the thing being described, and the analog, which is the thing that describes. In a normal metaphor, we, the readers, are given the topic and the analog, and we infer what characteristics should be assigned from analog to topic. For instance, with a classical example of next to me is a lion, we clearly see that lion is the analog describing the topic of a man, but we must infer the context from the context that attributes like ferocity and bravery should be assigned, while attributes like hairiness or the smell of a wild lion should not be. In The Arrival of Sadness, the poet inverts this by instead explicitly providing the topic like normal, but withholding the analog and in its place explicitly providing the attributes that should be assigned. For example, throughout the poem, the poet provides attributes like timelessness, universality, impact, and tradition to describe how they have experienced this ritual of sadness. Importantly, because the analog is missing, our minds, accustomed to the normal operation of metaphor, instead, it tries to find the analog, finding a concept that matches the criteria in the form of the attributes that are assigned to the topic. This, I think, allows the author two things. Firstly, they can shape these explicitly provided criteria in such a way that the resulting reader-crafted analog is a completely new concept, unrestricted by the actuality of whatever they could explicitly provide as an analog. And secondly, this type of operation forces the reader to search their own context, their subjectivity for the analog. This poem of the poet's own experience with sadness becomes an exercise in self-discovery for each reader, leading them to a new personal conception of sadness. And then in my response paper for the second week, I focused on the same poem, but I was mainly interested in the classical Chinese concepts of fu, bi, and xing. I found that these tools, identified in the classical Chinese tradition of poetic criticism, offers us some very dense and concise terms for the operation in The Arrival of Sadness that I just described. To review, fu, according to my understanding at least, fu is like a plot within the work, the literal happenings. So a single poem can have multiple different fu contained within it, and the metaphoric comparison between these fu produces the effect called pi. We can think about our discussions in the first week talking about tamthil, or analogy, or sentence-based metaphor. Both the analog and the topic in this style of metaphor can be seen as different fu, and their comparison produces pi. But xing is where things start getting complicated. My understanding of xing from the Owen reading is that it can be used to describe the affective image, like Gerald explained in the addendum to our second discussion, but it also seems to be used to describe that hard to grasp, beautiful, important aspect of poetry that dwells at the threshold between the poet and the reader, where the aesthetic experience of the poet is conveyed to the reader in the form of the aesthetic experience itself. That is, it isn't being described, it's actually being embodied. In connection with a poem, perhaps this semi-amorphous concept of xing illuminates a new understanding of the operation of the inverted metaphor. For me, it's still hard to wrap my head around, but it's this intention of the embodiment of an experience rather than its description that sets poetry, especially poems like this, apart from other literary forms. In Arrival, the inverted metaphor accomplishes the same sort of thing, focus on the reader, on evoking a certain experience within the reader that itself evokes xing. But this is also something that I've been thinking about since last lecture. It maybe does seem facile to compare these two traditions and find analogs between them like this, but I think what this comparison really does is much more profound. We find in cultural traditions that are so incredibly separated, like the classical Arabic and Chinese traditions, the same sort of operations, the same sort of poetic tendencies, the same sort of concepts, that once a civilization begins to try to capture the ineffable, they start using these things. Sure, the classical Arabic scholars focused on syntax and close analysis, while the classical Chinese scholars seem almost diametrically opposed to this type of criticism. all simplified, of course, but at the core, I think that the poetic movements resonate with each other and the different traditions and hit at some kind of universal tendency or even universal truth that must be innate to humans. That's the coolest thing for me and the reason why I'm interested in this field at all. And so that's all from me, and I look forward to seeing everybody.